Just as an update on that first webinar, I did post the slide deck on the Innovate website, and I am working on the closed captioning for the video, and I will get that up once that is set. So that is where we are on webinar number 1. And my name is Margaret Shippey. I am the serve in the role of Director of Faculty Excellence. Sorry, making up a title. Faculty Development and Classroom Engagement. And I have invited to join us today Barika Barbosa and Terry Grandal, who can give us some greater perspective on how to write proposals and write strong proposals. So before we hear from them, though, I do want to go through just a couple of housekeeping things. Barika, if you can go to the next slide. If you guys can just hang tight for a couple of minutes while we try to figure out our display from this end.
So. The application. Yeah, okay. So, oh, that's what you did? And then,
I just do the first one.
oh, okay, all right.
But you have to click on it.
I was doing application.
Okay, all right, we are back. Thank you. The slide before, Barika. So again, these are the two contributors I've invited to be with us today. Barika Barbosa is the Director of Learning and Program Evaluation. Terry Grandal is the Director of Resource Development. Terry is on her way, so we may need to, oh, she's walking in the door right now. So good timing. I was just about to go into some housekeeping details, and then we'll turn it over to Terry. So this is the overview of the session. We are going to start with technical components of a strong proposal. Terry's going to take that piece. And then this content of a strong proposal, Barika's going to do that piece. And then we'll do question and answer by chat. We are recording this session, just like we recorded the first session, and we will use that for folks that cannot be with us but are interested in the topic. So like I did with the first webinar, we'll put the slide deck up pretty quickly, and once we get the closed captioning on the recording, that will go up probably next week. It is one-way audio, so you'll hear from us verbally and through the text, obviously, and we'll hear from you through the chat feature. If you can hit the next slide. At the bottom of your screen by the clock, there's a little purple icon, and you can use that to submit a question through the chat feature at any point, and we'll just hang on to those questions and come to them at the end. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Terry. A lot of you already know her probably, and we're grateful to have her expertise and perspective with us today. Terry?
All right, thank you. And hi, everybody. So we're going to go over some of the technical aspects of any proposal, and then some specifics with the Innovation Fund proposal. Just note that it is a double-blind peer review process that we're going to go through for this for the Innovation Fund. So you're going to try to avoid using names in your proposal or any identifying information. So the reviewer is really judging your project and not necessarily who you are, who's proposing. We're trying to limit that a little bit. So the RFP, which is our request for proposal, that is your guideline. This is what you should be using and referring to over and over again. Whenever I talk about grants to anybody, I usually tell people to read it 3 times, just so you really comprehend what it is that it is asking you to do. Do the first one, go over it and just underline things that you find are important, especially when it comes to the questions. Then come back, highlight.
Okay, we're getting no sound.
Uh-oh.
I've got a message from the chat that there's no sound.
Uh-oh.
Can anybody hear us?
If you can hear us, can you say something? Like, let us know.
Okay, Dr. Garcia, I'm getting a message from you that you cannot hear us. Is it, can anybody else hear us? Okay, so Dr. Garcia, maybe it's something on your side, the speakers.
You can hear us.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Hanani's gonna take care of it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead.
So you want to read it every time. So be very mindful on the page limit. In this case, there is a 5-page limit, and that includes the cover page. So don't go over that. Reviewers are not requested to review anything above the page limit. And be mindful, like I said, of the questions. It helps to guide you in how you're going to present your project. And then the review criteria. How are the reviewers going to score your project, right? So that is all in the RFP. So make sure that you read it several times and becomes secondhand almost. And the most important one is look out for the deadline. You don't want to be late. So the deadline for this year is February 3rd and at 4:30 p.m., meaning if it's at 4:31, it is late. You have passed the deadline. Okay, so your 30-second, for those of you that have never written a grant in your life, the fastest thing to tell you is you want to make sure you answer the questions. Don't try to just propose. Look at the questions, make sure you're answering them. Usually we use that to create our outlines when we're helping others in writing grants. So use the questions in each of the sections and use them as your headings and make sure that you're addressing each one. But at the same time, you want to be concise. Again, you only have 5 pages. So make sure it's very clear. Don't include jargon. Don't include a lot of fluffy language. Just make sure that you're being able to describe your project and you're presenting it in a clear way. And of course, be consistent. Make sure that there's, if you can't, sometimes we're too married to a document and it's hard to step away. Have a peer review it and make sure that they understand what it is that you're doing and that it flows nicely. So if you're saying you're doing something, make sure it's consistent throughout your proposal. So start with your why. That is going to help guide you throughout what it is that you're trying to do. Hopefully somewhere at the end of your why, it has to do with student success, because at the end of the day, this is what we're here for. But why specifically are you choosing to do what it is that you're proposing to do? Why is it that you need these resources versus others, and why should your project be the one that gets selected? So keep that in the back of your hand. These questions are not specifically written in the RFP, but I want you to keep them in the back of your head as you are addressing the other questions, and your why will help guide. This also brings up who should be involved. This should not be a solo approach. Projects, whether it's the Innovation Fund or any grants particularly, you want to have people involved because it's going to take more than one person to write, and it's going to take more than one person to implement once you get awarded, if you're awarded. So make sure you include MDC administrators. It helps make sure that they have buy-in from the institution and that they're supportive of what it is that you're trying to do, and they can help you even frame it correctly. Colleagues from your area and from other areas, interdisciplinary approaches, as well as people from your unit. If you're, depending on your project, you're going to need others to kind of want to be engaged and stuff. So getting them involved early on is going to help you in the implementation process. Sometimes you're going to need external partners, so be mindful of that. You don't want to wait till the last minute to engage them. You want to try to reach out. Facilities is not all of your projects will require that, but some of you, if you're buying equipment, if you're buying or proposing something that has to do with equipment, usually we need to talk to facilities to make sure that that it's adaptable and that we can install it and all of that, because we've seen problems with that. If you're doing anything with data, institutional research is our house at the college for data. So, and want to make sure that
We'll be
you.
doing something with data.
Huh?
We'll be doing something with
Yeah,
data.
so, exactly, yeah, that's true, but I don't know if they're doing it themselves or. So you are going to be expected to measure things, include IR to see what kind of data we're capturing, especially at the writing piece, because you don't want to say we're going to measure this, this, and this, and then realize that that's not data we're capturing at the institution. And then resource development, and this is a good stepping stone for bigger and other external grant funding. So make sure you keep us involved in your proposal, and whether it gets chosen for the innovation fund or not, it may be something we can look at for external funding. So yeah, keep us involved in that. All right, so of course you're going to need goals as part of your RFP, and specifically ask you about your goals. And I just wanted to make a quick note, so your goals are overarching. They're like, what is it, the big thing that you're trying to do? Objectives are usually what you're doing to measure that you are addressing your goals. Now, we don't list objectives specifically in this RFP. We talk about the outcomes. But some of you are familiar with grants and know that this is usually how we set it up. So although it's not written in the RFP, keep it in mind that your goals are not the measurable piece. Your objectives are what you measure towards your goal. And I can answer questions about that because I'm sure it'll be confusing. And all right, so when you're talking about your project design, which is one of the components of this proposal, make sure that you're, again, back to being clear and consistent. This is where you're going to put on all the detailed steps. You're going to talk about your approach. You're going to talk about what it is you're going to do. And when you're talking about detailed steps, usually the recommendation I give people is, if you get kidnapped by an alien tomorrow and somebody were to take on your project, they should be able to know exactly what it is that you're attempting to do based on what you wrote in this area. So this includes the timeline, who's going to be responsible for what are your milestones, and things like that. And then, of course, include your evidence and your evidence base. Why are you choosing to do what you're doing? What's the evidence that shows that this is going to work? And of course, the resources needed. So how you're going to use the funding and other resources, whether it's a part of the funding or not. Then when we talk about resources, of course, budget. Budget is always a fun category in grants, and some people don't love it as much as I do. But these are some of your basic categories in a budget, and when we're talking about grants and in the Innovation Fund as well. So your direct costs, which are your personnel or task points. Your fringe benefits, so if you're doing task points, you do have to calculate fringe, and we are going to have the fringe benefits calculator available when we post the webinar, so that way you have that as a guide. And any travel that you're going to, some people may need to travel to either because it's part of the dissemination or just part of the project, so make sure that you're looking at that. Equipment for some of you, supplies. And contractual, if you're contracting somebody, like an agreement for services to do something, that would be another area. And then training stipends and things like that. So those are some general. Of course, your project may not include all of these, or may include all of them. It all depends on what you are proposing to do. So some common weaknesses. The poor organization, again, if you are being clear, concise, and you're talking about the details, you want to make sure that you're consistent and it flows nicely. So, make sure you're doing that. Answer the questions, we mentioned that. So these are things that we often see in the grant proposals that we receive, so I wanted to share so you don't make these mistakes in your proposal for the Innovation Fund. The details, make sure you get out of your head and out of your area, and that's why I recommend having somebody, a colleague that maybe doesn't work in what you do, or is not as familiar with what you're trying to propose, to review it. Having an outside perspective helps, because it helps fill in those gaps, especially when you're using a lot of terminology and jargon and things like that. Another one, an unrealistic timeline. Be real about what it is that you're doing. A lot of times we tend to be a little overambitious. I think we can get everything done in 3 months, and that's not true. So make sure you're pacing yourself and that you're doing the things when it's realistic. And then the objectives not being measurable. We are going to use measurement, and Marika's going to address all of that later, but, so yeah. With that, we pass that on.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry. Okay, everyone, now we're going to talk about your content and how to build strong content for your proposal. We want you to be grounded in student learning. So you'll get these slides later and you'll see the link to the MDC Student Learning Outcomes, which I know everyone is familiar with, knows them by heart, and puts them on their syllabi. So the 10 learning outcomes. We want the foundation of your proposal to be grounded in supporting the student learning. Not to say that you're going to necessarily increase mastery on any one of the student learning outcomes, but that you're going to ground the foundation to support student learning in any one of the student learning outcomes. So we recommend that you pick no more than 3. Probably 1 is your best bet, right? But we also want you to think about where the intersection between that student learning outcome is, what you're curious about, and what your big ideas or what you know to be learning challenges for students in this area, and sort of start there, right? What problems do you see or obstacles have you encountered in terms of students getting to that level of engagement, mastery, and or success related to a specific area, skill, behavior, attitude around a student learning outcome? This should be where you start at first. So next, talk about where you want to impact student learning. Is it engagement, right? Are you involved in a discipline where the text is complex to read, and we see students disengage during class time because they're not necessarily prepared for class? So do we want to increase engagement? Is that the component that you're focused on? Yes, related to student learning, but not about mastery. Or are we looking at success, retention, completion rates, things like that? Those core indicators of student success, and beyond that, right? Those are just some ways that we define student success. But this is talking about your proposal. What is the area that you intend to impact? Be it engagement, student success, or student learning. And of course, I saved student learning for the last piece because this is the piece that I think we're most familiar with in terms of student mastery and achievement, right? I want my students to be able to think critically, and I'm looking for my proposal to define or implement an innovative way to increase student critical thinking skills, right? I'm going to do I'm going to implement some specific strategy to increase mastery. So think about which area you're going to impact in terms of student learning. We want you to consult the literature as well, right? In the proposal guidelines, there are some specific areas that we're addressing this year that have to do with high impact practices, project-based learning, and digital, as well as digital learning. So high impact practices, teaching and learning practices that are grounded in research and support diverse populations, right? We see student learning and engagement increase as the amount of high impact practices a student engages in their course of their educational experience. So definitely, there's a whole list of them by AAC&U. Many of the faculty members here at the college are implementing these already. Our QEP is based in one of the high impact practices, and a version of a high impact practice, the writing to learn strategies. And also there's a lot of work being done about project-based learning as well. And the infusion of digital learning and what that really means specifically for our students. So you started with your student learning outcome, you've identified where your interest is peaked in terms of that student learning outcome. Are you curious about a phenomenon that's happening? Do you want to zoom in on a specific population? So you're linking it to something that you're passionate about, and then you're consulting literature about what are some research-based, evidence-driven strategies that you can use or explore within your specific project. And then next, we want you to define your success indicators, right?
So in the beginning, I started off by saying that we're not expecting that every project has a student mastery focus, because we know that there are some things that have to happen first before we see student performance actually increase, right? And maybe some of those areas we haven't defined as well yet. So we also want to make sure that proposals address this, or we want to leave the space for proposals to address this as well, right? So the first is student engagement, as we talked about earlier, and maybe your project goal is about belongingness and inclusion or equity-minded practices, right? These are all topics that are trending in higher ed now, and they're topics that maybe we should have been talking about 20 years ago. But how are, we at MDC, we don't have an access issue, right? We have very diverse populations here at the college, but our equity-minded or equity-conscious strategies, maybe that's an area for which some people are curious about, passionate about, and would like to explore, right? So people are at the table, but does everyone have an equal voice at the table, or are some people being undermined? And then our indicators for success about that are perception, participation rates, things that we think will then impact student mastery, but they're the starting point for which we're engaging with students, right? And we're not going to go too much into measures today, but we'll talk more about that later. What do those measurements actually look like? But just think about what would let you know if your project was working or not, right? Those are your indicators for success. In the next area, student success, the goal would be persistence and completion. Just to give you an example, this is obviously not an exhaustive list. And I would look at things like retention rates, course-to-course retention, class success rates, the percentage of W's versus the percentage of completers, things like that. And then lastly, student learning outcomes. Obviously, the goal for this is student mastery, right? Increase students' ability to demonstrate quantitative reasoning skills, right? And my indicator for success would be a direct measurement of evidence that a student can show me that they know how to think critically, use and apply quantitative reasoning skills. Those are more of your performance-based measures, even your objective measures that would be embedded in the class and or co-curricular activity. So just some ideas to get you started on this project or on this proposal. And also make sure to build in assessment and evaluation, right? And Terry touched on, Teresa, sorry. Touched on this earlier in terms of measurement, how, when, and where we're going to measure. And we're looking at things like quality, efficiency, productivity, operations, and activities, and also, of course, student mastery, student learning. So just an idea, I know we're going to talk about this later in session 4. Yep, so we'll go into measurement then, we'll go into measures and timelines and how to build that in to your actual proposal. But I was told not to go too deep on this right now today. But so I'm going to end here with scalability, right? Because this is the President's Innovation Fund is sort of an idea to get you started, right? But obviously, we're looking for this scholarship to go beyond whatever project or proposal is implemented and funded, and to think about how would this now be, how can we use this to contribute to the larger college community, right? Can it be expanded to your discipline, or can it be expanded college-wide? Is it interdisciplinary? Is it co-curricular? And when we're thinking about scalability, we're not asking you to think through the process of scale. What we're saying for you to build in to your project, what kind of evidence would I need for this to go beyond just my class, my students, into a multi-section approach or something that would be college-wide, right? So just to start thinking about that, right? What evidence would I need to be able to share with my colleagues so that we could invest in this strategy or innovation to take it to the next level? So with that, I think we'll end there, or we'll start with questions.
Right, and right now, we don't have any questions.
Oh, okay.
So I'm gonna let it sink in a little bit, and maybe, because I feel like we did go through some kind of heavy stuff kind of fast.
Yes.
So if anybody wants us just to go back to a slide and go over it again, that would be a fair question. So I'm gonna let people do some typing, some thinking.
Well, I'll pose a question.
Okay.
Does anyone on the call or on the webinar today know what area they like or they're thinking about impacting? Are you looking at student engagement? Are you looking at student success? Or are you looking at student learning?
So that's a question for faculty who are considering proposing. We can go back to the
Oh, yeah.
slide.
Maybe that.
So we have one contribution, and others are typing. I can see we've got one vote for learning.
Okay, great.
Student learning and engagement.
Okay.
What do you think about tackling two in one proposal, for example? Support for faculty and budget issues, vendors, equipment. So I think that's more getting into the
We have
budget
questions?
side. Yeah, but we have answers to your questions, and then we can come back to this one.
Okay.
So I've got 2 votes for learning and 1 for, well, one of those includes engagement.
Okay. So in
Engagement.
engagement, okay. All right, so definitely want to consult the research on this. There's a lot of information out there in terms of student engagement, right? What's working, where are the gaps in literature for this? And I think this is sort of definitely on our radar for MDC, you know, in terms of, because of our diversity, you know, with the student population as well as with faculty and staff. You know, when I go out to conferences, I get this question a lot about equity practices, about diversity and inclusion and things like that. So I don't know if that's where you're going with engagement, but it would be interesting to see if any of those aspects fit into your proposals. And for the learning part, of course, yes, this is where I live. This is what I love to hear. So make sure that if you are focusing on a student learning outcome and that your intention is to increase how students are doing in terms of mastery, that you have at least one direct measure of student learning, right? So when we talk about data, we want to see student performance related to your project on that student learning outcome if you're proposing that student learning is going to be the focus, right? Of course, you can focus on student learning and not, your intention not be the impact of performance, right? Because we can also talk about engagement in relationship to student learning, right? But that you would have at least, if your focus is student learning, that you would have at least one direct measure. You can have a variety of indirect measures, surveys, interviews, focus groups, things like that, but that if your intention is to increase performance on related to student learning, that you have at least one direct measure. So if you're going to use, let's say just for example, it's about communication, right? And students are going to, you know, in a chemistry course, instead of them taking a lab because it's for non-chemistry majors, they are going to teach students, either peers or students younger than themselves, about principles of chemistry, right? So we would need to evaluate that from a student perspective, right? Am I going to have a rubric about their teaching demonstration, right? And then tally up those scores and talk about the frequency distribution for which students are performing on that, right? That was just totally one example off the top of my head, but you see where we're going here, right? Because we want to talk about now, okay, you have the seed money, you've implemented something in a course, and now how can we take it further? And what do we know about it, and what do we still not know, right? What worked and what still needs to be explored, kind of thing, right?
Since we have
yeah.
time, can you
Yeah.
suggest like a few examples of direct measures? You mentioned like a presentation that's graded by a rubric, that could be a direct measure, something else?
So objective tests also measures of student learning. You know, we want to talk about test blueprints and things like that. Because I think we're beyond recall recognition, right? So in terms of value and worth and where we're going to put our energy. But yes, student product as well. Maybe students are going to create infographics. So that also would be a direct measure graded with a rubric, right? Or a checklist, right? So those kinds of things that we would want to see come out of a project like this.
Do we need measures for student engagement is our next question.
Yes, we do need measures for student engagement. So we need measures for every one of these areas. The student learning outcomes one, the student learning part, would be the one where we need the most direct, right? But for student engagement, it's a different sort of, it's a different area, right? So the kind of evidence that we'll be able to collect for student engagement will be different. There will be perception data, right? There'll be survey data. It'll be self-reported. It'll be more qualitative data. There'll be a mix of quantitative data, but it'll be definitely more qualitative data. We'll be doing some content analysis on that, right? If you are looking at student engagement, and we're looking for to measure underserved populations, right? We're looking to see how a specific strategy impacts veterans students, right? Students who have veteran status. And do they feel encouraged, a sense of belonging? Do they feel dismissed? Things like that, right? Just totally examples. I'm not trying to drive anyone in any specific area. But for that, we would need surveys. We would need, depending on your population and how big your implementation is, maybe surveys is not the best because we're only working with 15 students. So maybe interviews is a better indicator of or a better measure of our success, right? And then that would be content analysis on that data. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're going to go back to a question. I haven't forgotten the one about support for faculty, but while we have Barika on a roll, I want to take one more question to her. Should we focus on only one success indicator?
Oh, well, some of them overlap. So, and maybe you already have a project in the works, and this is sort of a continuation of something. So I wouldn't necessarily limit us to one success indicator. I wouldn't really do more than two, though. But the student success, sometimes this increase in student learning, the byproduct of that is course-to-course retention rates, right? Even though it's maybe not the focus of your project, but it might be a measure of yours. But I think I would limit where you're going to expend your energies in terms of your project design to one or two areas.
I would say that be mindful that, you know, of the funding size and the size of your project and how overambitious you would like to be. And this is a stepping stone to maybe a larger project. So, you know, when you're considering that, you know, take that into consideration.
I I second that. A clean, well thought out, well structured project. I will say I'm not a voting member of the review committee, but I think just from my experience working with faculty who have presented or proposed ideas, not just through this, but through other areas, the more complicated ideas get messy. And even if it might be funded, but then it's messy and you have to untangle some of the ideas that were in the proposal and maybe have to let some things go. So it's better to understand it is an award of $10,000 up to, potentially. That's what we're working with. You don't want to bite off more than you can chew, and I think Barika said it well, just enough to make a case for whether or not this is innovation, an innovation that should be further discussed, further considered, either in your department or even across other disciplines. We have a follow-up from the question about student engagement. You asked, does that help? And she said, a bit, but can engagement be general belongingness and not about specific underserved populations?
Oh, yes. I was sorry if I was conflating the two examples, but it could just be belongingness, or it can be about serving other underserved populations.
So I do want to make sure we go back to the budget question. And, support for faculty and budget issues, vendors, equipment, I think is kind of an et cetera list. We touched on this in webinar number 1, that the budget will live at your campus in your department. And so you, as the faculty member, will manage that budget, and your chairperson will be the budget manager. You'll make the decisions, and the chairperson will support you in the actual technical management of the budget. So that a lot of support will come from your chair, and that is one reason we added the cover sheet. We modified the cover sheet this year to include a signature from the chairperson, expressing acknowledgement that they are aware of your project, that they support it, and they understand their role in it. So a lot of that support will come from the chairperson or from the department, perhaps from the campus even. And then, but we will provide a little bit of training right at the outset. Once we get the budget set up, then, you'll set them up, but we need to provide you some training on how to go about that. So there is support, but it's going to come from lots of different places, and sometimes you need to ask for it. I'll just put that out there. Don't drown. Go ahead and ask for help. And I
was just gonna follow up because they said something about vendors. Just because this is college funded, just be mindful that there are approved vendors for certain things. So, and that is a timely process. So, when you're thinking about what kind of expenses and vendors and people that you're gonna bring on board, you may want to check during your writing phase with our procurement office about what that looks like. If somebody is not already a vendor, what will it take? Because you don't want to spend too much time during your project implementation, if you're awarded, on trying to get somebody registered as a vendor. What does an agreement for services look like, and all of that? So if that's what you're referring to, make sure you're asking those questions now. So if you are awarded, you can hit the ground running, and it doesn't take away from your project.
Good input.
Very good point.
Budget mixing it way too much.
Yes. Budgets are not fun, but
Yeah.
they are a big part of the process, and the more you can pre-think your budget, even like Terry said, just is this person even set up as a vendor? Can we set them up as a vendor? And as I said in the first webinar, there are actually some things that we cannot spend college funds on.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I learned that when I came into this stuff, like drones. I don't know if that's changed, but I was told no drones. Okay. So you might want to, find out if your project is built around something that might not actually be fundable through with college monies. That's a question that needs to be explored now. And Terry's going to follow up, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, yeah, one last thing with the budget, since you mentioned that, now be mindful that these are considered restricted funds, and restricted funds are managed differently than your regular operating budgets. So there are probably even more restrictions on what you can spend money on. So it's not just your general college stuff, but then when we talk about restricted funds, whatever you put in your proposal, that's how restricted accounts will set up your budget in MD Connect. So you want to be very mindful when you're thinking about this and how you're going to spend your money, because that's how it's going to be reflected in MD Connect. And then if you have to change it, there's a whole other process for that. Yeah, those are things.
So I see a question about reflective journaling. Sorry to go back to the learning outcomes. I know we're running out of time. But yes, you can use this as a measure. But you have to outline what your criteria for success is in terms of what you're looking for in reflective journaling, right? Like, are you doing a content analysis because you're looking for certain words to appear, or are we looking for growth in between a specific for a specific student related to a learning outcome, right? That students can think critically about a topic or something. How are you going to capture that information from this writing measure in the end, right? And summarize it to talk about the data. But yes.
And I see one more question coming in, but we don't have time, but I can address that through the frequently asked questions. They've been posted online, and I will update them as we have these kinds of questions that come in that can be addressed through that venue. So I will get back to that question about international travel for students through the FAQs online, and you should always be going back to that website to see the updates. Like I said, in about a week, hopefully, fingers crossed, the recording for this will be up, but by the end of the week, the slide deck will be up, and the calculator for French benefits, we'll put that tool up there as well. There is the email address. If you have questions, you can send your questions there. And thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Marika, for bringing your expertise to this audience. And we'll see you, and I think the next one is in 3 weeks, and the next webinar is on the lit review. So we'll hope to see you in webinar number 3. Have a good afternoon.